I'm very pleased that we are joined today by Praveen Kadle with Tata Capital, one of the premier business groups in India, and I'm very pleased to have you here as an expert on investing in India. I'm very interested to hear about the opportunities in India for investors and also the economic growth in the country and where you see business and the economy headed in India. But before we delve into all those topics, I'd love to get a little bit about your background and how you came to your current role and what your role consists of.
Yeah, no, basically, first of all, let me thank you for inviting me to join on your channel. And we'll be very happy to answer all your questions on the Indian economy and investing in the Indian economy. To give you my background, I'm basically a finance professional. I'm a qualified chartered accountant and have been in the finance profession for almost last 30 years now. I have been in the Tata Group for last 20 years out of these 30 years. And now, of course, I'm the CEO of Tata Capital. But prior to that, for about 12 years, I was working with Tata Motors as a CFO. And out of which about 6 years I was as the board member and CFO of Tata Motors. So during my period as a CFO in Tata Motors, we completed the well-known acquisition of Jaguar Land Rover, and prior to that in 2003 we did the acquisition of the Daewoo Truck Company in South Korea. Was also part of the turnaround that happened in Tata Motors from 2000 to 2002, and then of course the subsequent growth of Tata Motors from predominantly an Indian company into a global company. And now, of course, for the last close to 5 years now, I have been working as a CEO of Tata Capital. Started actually Tata Capital in September 2007.
Mm-hmm. And what kind of investing do you focus on in Tata Capital?
We are basically catering to the two customer segments. One is the corporate segment and the other one is the consumer or the retail segment.
Mm-hmm.
And in the corporate segment as well as in the retail segment, our mission is to become the most admired financial solution partner for our both corporate as well as the retail clients. So when it comes to the corporate clients, we help them in terms of raising the money for their expansion, for their growth, for their new projects, or for the startup activities. And our service is basically in terms of providing either the equity capital or the debt capital. If it is debt capital, then maybe in the form of short-term debt, working capital debt, or the long-term debt from the point of view of the project financing or for the purchase of capital expenditure. When it comes to the equity, we have both private equity as well as we give access to the public markets to them, both in the domestic market as well as in international market. So we have, as a part of our support to these corporate clients, we have private equity, and we have raised so far close to $1 billion, which is basically meant for investing into both Tata as well as non-Tata companies. So we have two separate funds. So one fund is predominantly for investing into the unlisted Tata companies, and the other one is for investing into the non-Tata companies. And when we talk about non-Tata companies, we have specific focus in healthcare in one area and one of the themes. The other one is also agnostic. So we have healthcare fund in non-Tata area as well as we have the agnostic in non-Tata area. As far as the investment into the unlisted Tata companies, that's another fund where we are kind of providing the access to the large institutional investors to invest into the unlisted Tata companies. Tata as a group, as an industrial group, has never ever kind of allowed the entry of the private equity players into any of their group companies, except maybe just two investments made by Temasek, the Singapore government of Singapore organization, which has invested into two companies in the telecommunication and the DTH kind of a direct to home entertainment kind of a business model that we started. But other than these two investments, Tata Group, which is more than 100 years old, had never allowed the entry of the private sector or private equity players into Tata Group unlisted companies. Now the Tata Group is growing, and there are too many demands on the group by many of these operating companies to provide equity support to them. So we, Tata Capital, which is almost 100% owned by Tata Sons, the parent company, decided to create an alternate investment vehicle for Tata Sons. So we, along with Tata Sons, invest in the unlisted Tata companies. So that's the focus of this particular fund. And this fund then kind of invest in these unlisted companies, and at some stage would exit by way of IPO or buyout by the main operating company, or maybe strategic sale. In the other fund which I talked about, which is the agnostic fund, that is basically investing into the non-Tata companies, where companies want equity support, the private equity support. And we are not just providing the financial support, we are not just the financial investor, we are a value creator in true sense. And how do we create value in these companies? We create value by providing the expertise that we have in the group, because we are a large group, having invested and having participated in almost all the sectors of the Indian economy. And wherever we have invested, we are either number one or number two. That gives a lot of kind of a skilled resources to us. And what we are doing is provide these resources to the companies in which we are investing. So it could be in the area of technology, it could be in the area of quality, it could be in the area of marketing, either domestic or international marketing, it could be in the area of human resource support, it could be in the area of IT support, it could be in the area of identifying some strategic partners for them. So that's what we are doing in terms of creating value in these companies. So our business model in terms of private equity is different as compared to many private equity players you find. We are actually creating value by supporting these companies in which we invest in terms of all these areas which I mentioned. And that's how we kind of create a value. Private equity is a major business for us. Of course, we are new, but we would like to create a kind of a distinct model, business model of how a private equity promoted by a large industrial house can succeed in a country like India, which is, as you know, is a difficult country to operate in. And having a support of a large industrial house getting into the private equity certainly makes big sense for the institutional investors who otherwise would have found it difficult to make the investments directly on their own.
Sure. And so both of these funds are open to outside investors?
Yes.
And those are pension funds or
Yeah.
those kinds of investors?
We are also looking at another area like Africa, for example. We believe that the next growth, now we all talk about the emerging markets like the BRIC countries and all that, but the next growth you will find will be in African continent. Now the Tata Group has got a huge presence in Africa. Over the last 40 years we started with Zambia initially, and then subsequently we have spread our presence across the entire African continent. We have very strong presence in South Africa. We have a strong presence in the other parts of Africa. So we are looking at creating an Africa fund,
Hmm.
and basically to help the companies which are planning to make investments in Africa, where they would need some capital support and where they would also need some support from the same thing which I talked about. They would also need some support from a large industrial house. So that's another fund which we are planning to set up, and that's another area where the investors can look at making investment.
That's very interesting. Maybe there will be another opportunity to talk about
Yes.
that as well. I'd love to hear about where you think India is today in terms of the economy and the development of the business sector. You know, in the West we hear a lot about the outsourcing sector in India, but I know that the Tata Group is active in really across the board, and you have a very good feel for the pulse of the economy. How would you characterize it today?
I think Indian economy has seen significant growth over the last 5 to 6 years, a growth of almost 9% almost every year, except maybe last year or one, in 2008, 2009 when we had the global financial crisis. But otherwise, the country has seen 9% kind of a growth. And I personally believe India can even have double-digit growth, not only for a couple of years but many more years. Why I am so confident is because of the demographic advantage which the country has. B, India is a very strong domestic economy, and the domestic consumption demand is quite huge. It's also linked to the demographic advantage. The third thing is the rural economy, which is almost 70% of the Indian economy, is growing, and you're seeing significant amount of income generation in the rural markets, and that will create huge amount of the demand for consumption goods as well as the other kind of facilitating kind of goods and services. So that's the other factor. The next factor why the country should do very well is the infrastructure demand. India has got poor infrastructure in almost all the segments, whether it is roads, whether it is ports, airports, irrigation, power generation, and so on and so forth. So India needs huge investment in the infrastructure area. In fact, as per the Planning Commission, Indian Planning Commission requirements, India needs almost $1 trillion kind of an investment over the next 5 years. Now, when you make these kind of investments in the infrastructure, it has got a lot of multiplier and acceleration effect on the other sectors of the economy. It creates jobs, it creates income, it creates kind of a demand for a lot of related goods and services, and therefore when the country would make this kind of investment into the infrastructure area, it will create huge amount of demand, and therefore the economy should grow. Now there is a misconception that India is basically an outsourcing hub. Yes, it is an outsourcing hub, but India also is now seeing a significant growth in the manufacturing segment. Today, manufacturing accounts for 16% of the overall economy. The Government of India has recently come out with a manufacturing strategy roadmap by which the government is very keen. By executing that roadmap, they would like to have the manufacturing sector to grow from 16% to 25% of the overall economy. And that's possible because India generates a huge amount of engineering talent, huge amount of technical skill. Of course, one may argue that whatever we generate is still not sufficient, and I agree with that. But still, India is generating huge amount of engineering and technical talent, which can be used for developing this manufacturing sector. So you will very soon find that India will become a kind of a huge manufacturing base for the rest of the world. India also, of course, offers the low-cost labor advantage, but with the necessary skills. One can, as I said, one can argue that the skill supply is still very low, but I think there are a lot of universities, educational institutions which are coming in, which will provide this kind of a skill, or which will fill in the skill gap. Of course, thanks to the British rule that India had for almost 150 years, we have the advantage of the English language speaking people. We have got a strong judicial system. We have got reasonably good administrative and bureaucratic system for running the entire administration of the country, though you may argue that it is very slow and maybe also corrupt, but that's okay. But I think India still has got a strong bureaucratic and administration system. While I have talked about these advantages, I also must tell you right now, India is at a crossroad, because we are going to see about 7 or 7.5% growth in the current year, mainly account of some factors which have emerged over the last 12 months or 24 months. To start with, it's inflation. The inflation levels are very high in India, especially driven by the food grain inflation. And now we are also seeing the inflation because of from the manufacturing side inflation. Then of course, because the inflation is very high, the Reserve Bank of India, which is the central bank, has consistently increased the interest rates. So the interest rates are very high. So you have got high inflation, high interest rates. Then of course the third factor is the issue related to the currency depreciation. India still has got a huge trade deficit and overall deficit. The expected deficit in the current year is expected to be around between 5 and 5.5% of the GDP, which is reasonably high, and that is also weakening the Indian currency. So you are seeing Indian rupee depreciating against the dollar almost 17 or 18% over the last 6 months. So that's another impediment when we talk about inflation control and the growth. The other factor which has to some extent created some lack of confidence amongst the industrialists is the government decision-making paralysis. A lot of decisions have been deferred, especially related to the reforms in many areas which would actually help the economy to grow, and the government has either deferred these reforms process, or it has been kind of paralyzed because of the coalition compulsions which the government has, because we have right now the coalition government, and therefore you have seen the growth coming down because of all these factors to around maybe 7 to 7.5%. However, I am very confident that if some of these issues are taken care of, which I believe will be taken care of, because we have some elections in some 4 or 5 major states in month of March or April. Once these elections are over, I'm quite sure you may see some kind of this whole paralysis in terms of government decision making hopefully will be stepped aside. Government will start taking decisions, the confidence building process will start, and the industrialists who are gone a bit slow, or business people who have gone a bit slow in terms of expansion and growth projects, will again embark upon these growth projects or expansion, and then that will give some momentum. Inflation also will come down, and we will see perhaps maybe 8 to 9% growth maybe in the next 18 to 24 months. As I said, I am very optimistic that the country should, based on all the positive factors which I talked about earlier, in terms of demographic advantage, in terms of a strong domestic demand, the investments that are likely to happen in infrastructure, the rural economy growing where we have 70% of population, I think we should be seeing double-digit kind of a growth over a much longer period.
And could you contrast a little bit how you see India versus China? It's not necessarily as competitors, but just the difference in what's driving the economic growth. And whenever I look at it, I conclude that unlike China, India is a democracy, and often in a democracy it's harder to get the government moving and get some things done. But I feel like there's a stronger foundation because things are driven by a more free market, whereas in China you have the government really very deep in every part of the economy, and I don't know to what extent in India there's the kind of property bubble that there is in China. Probably it doesn't exist in India, does it?
No, I think first of all, let me start by saying, the reform process started in China almost a decade earlier. China started its reforms process in 1978-79. India started its reforms process in 91-92. So we were late by almost a decade. Then of course, as you mentioned, democracy has its own advantages as well as disadvantages. And many a times when you have a kind of a coalition government, which is what unfortunately India has had for the last almost now 15 to 16 years, puts its own pressures in terms of having a good strong reform process consistently kind of introduced and kind of executed. And that's the problem, which has not been done because of the coalition government compulsions. And therefore we are having this a slower economic reforms and economic growth as compared to China. If you see China, it has been almost last 20 years, it has been growing in double digits, 12% kind of average GDP growth, whereas we have seen 8 to 9% growth only in the last 5 to 6 years. So that's because of the reform processes being impacted because of the coalition government compulsions. The other disadvantage which India has is the kind of you would say that because they started the process of reforms much earlier, the investment flow from many of the international players or companies or industries started, and then because it's a huge market, the inflow of capital investment was much larger and continued to be much larger. To some extent, it also was facilitated by quick decision making, which unfortunately in India got hampered because of the coalition compulsions or slowdown in the reform process. So the inflow of capital into India has been much lower as compared to what has happened in China. So you have a strong kind of reserves in China, almost $3 trillion, whereas we can talk about only $300 billion of foreign exchange reserves. The Chinese economy also, during the boom period of the global economy, China participated in a big way through its export oriented business activities or growth or economic growth. And that also helped them, because when the whole world economy was booming, say from 1990 till about 2007, almost 16 or 17 years, China could participate in a big way because of its thrust on the export growth, whereas India always looked at the internally in terms of domestic consumption. So the capacities in India are much lower when you look at any product or services as compared to what China has to offer. And that's why maybe the growth momentum in China continued to be much bigger for all these years. It can also play the other way, because now when you see the world economy slowing down, China will have maybe lower growth as compared to the Indian economy, because Indian economy is purely driven by the domestic consumption demand. Almost 90% is driven by the domestic consumption demand. And that's what perhaps would help India going forward. India also has got a demographic advantage, much better than what China has. In fact, in Chinese case, it will be slowly it will become a negative kind of advantage, whereas in India it's a positive demographic advantage which will continue for almost next 40 years, and that's a long period, and you will therefore see a significant amount of the demographic dividend helping the strong consumption demand. So then of course India has the advantage of the English language speaking people. India has the advantage of a strong legal system, and therefore I think business people will find kind of doing business in India much more comfortable because of a kind of a strong legal system. Although one may argue that it is slow, but yes, at least there is some good, strong, well-established legal system which has been there for more than 100 years because of the British rule in India. I think people talk about China being a strong manufacturing hub and India being a strong service or outsourcing hub, but I think things will change. When it comes to manufacturing, you will find that especially in the case of high value add or high engineering content kind of a products, you will find that Indians or India will have a better advantage as compared to China. So I think while China has seen significant growth over the last 20 years, much better than or much higher than India, I think going forward you will see, especially from 2015 onwards, I would say that India will see higher growth as compared to China, and that particular phase will continue for at least next 20 years or so. Unless, because we are a democratic country, we somehow mess up the situation.
And what sectors or industries do you find most interesting from an investment perspective in India?
I think I first of all initially talked about the demographic advantage. Now when you talk about huge population which is in the age group of 0 to 60, almost about 80% of India's population will be in this age group of 0 to 60, and that will be there for almost next 40 years, this kind of a high percentage. Two things, one, of course, it's a big demographic dividend or advantage, but it can also be a demographic liability if it is not handled properly. Now let me explain. When you have got so many young children in the system, the young population in the system, you need to provide education to them so that they can get jobs, or they can get employability, or they can get into earning capabilities in terms of business or whatever it is. The second one is healthcare. So healthcare is another kind of a strong need. So low cost education and low cost health is going to be the key requirement of the economy. So I think I would say that these are the two strong investment areas for anybody to make investment in terms of, this is a huge opportunity in terms of education and healthcare, and as I mentioned, more predominantly the low cost health and education. Then of course, when you have got such a good advantage of demography and strong population and strong domestic demand, the other area will be the consumer products, the fast moving consumer goods, the consumer durables, the what should I say, the aspiration level of Indian population because of the access to communication channels, access to the outside world, international world. Now everything is, you can see, sitting at home. So the aspiration level of Indian population is very high, and therefore they would like to have the same kind of a consumer goods which you consume here in Europe or in the North American market, they would like to consume in India. So fast moving consumer goods, consumer durables, that's another area where you will have huge demand. And that's where I think we have already started seeing companies the Korean companies like Samsung and LG have set up huge capacities, and they are growing exponentially in India in consumer durables. Many of the fast-moving consumer goods companies from Europe as well as North America are making entry, and they are establishing themselves because that will be the growth area. Related to that would be, the infrastructure, because the infrastructure is, as I mentioned earlier, is poor, and infrastructure actually creates, lack of infrastructure actually creates the disadvantage in terms of moving the goods faster, quicker, and we generate so much of food produce, but then it becomes, because it's perishable, and if it is not transported immediately, then it kind of gets wasted, and that's why that's another opportunity in terms of making investments in infrastructure. Of course, there are governmental hurdles in terms of land acquisition, in terms of policy clearances, etc., etc. But of course, now, as I said, I am an optimist, so these issues will get sorted out, and there could be huge opportunity in terms of making investments in infrastructure. But of course, the payback period is much longer in any country as far when you make investments in infrastructure. Manufacturing is another area. The engineering goods manufacturing, automobiles, because the automobile penetration so far was very low. Now India is becoming one of the biggest markets. It's already now the 6th largest automobile market in the world, and very soon you will find maybe it will become the 3rd largest automobile market in the world. So automobile is another growth area, and related to automobile, the automobile component manufacturing. So that will be another growth area. Electronics, and telecom would be another growth area. As I said, because of the consumer durables, the component making for electronic would be another growth area. So I think then I talk about servicing, and you already mentioned this point about outsourcing. India has got as I said, because of the strong demographic advantage, and if the skill level development and education is taken care of, India will generate lots of people who can contribute in the services sector, whether it is in IT, whether it is hospitality, whether it is in terms of financial services, whether it is in terms of any of the back office support kind of areas. So India can also become a very strong service provider to the rest of the world. It's already doing that, but will become hopefully a much stronger kind of a service provider. So overall, I think these are the areas where you can see that investments can, if you make investments, you can get good returns.
And a lot of the companies that you have access to, obviously, Western investors do not have access to on their own. How would short of investing in your funds, would you recommend that Western investors look at companies that trade in India on the stock exchange, or what would be a good way of getting to know some of the players?
No, I think talking specifically about Tata Capital, since you raised this point, yes, we provide the investment vehicle for investing into private equity, but we also have got the wealth management group. So the individuals who want to invest in India, whether it is in the mutual fund, because we have a Tata Mutual Fund, we have a securities broking company called Tata Securities. So, and we have of course the Tata Capital Wealth Management Group. So people who are interested in, I'm talking about more about the retail investors.
In India or anywhere?
No, I'm talking more about India.
Yeah, sure.
Because we, being predominantly an Indian company, we offer that kind of an advantage of, first of all, access to Indian market, but more importantly, the Tata name, which denotes trust and confidence, in one of the oldest groups in India, more than 100 years old, and which group which always follows the high value systems and ethical standards. So therefore, people who are interested in investing in India and take the advantage of investing in the fixed income instruments or equity instruments or mutual fund instruments or any of the instruments can perhaps invest through Tata Capital. And we have we have a presence in Singapore, and Singapore is becoming the hub for private banking. And Singapore government has gone on record saying that they want to create Singapore as the global hub for private banking. So we have a presence in Singapore, we have presence in London, we may open more centers in Europe and North America. So any of the international investors who would be very keen to invest in India, they can look at Tata Capital.
That's very very interesting. And do you see any Western companies that come to India? Which ones have impressed you as doing a good job in terms of penetrating the markets and getting their products or services sold in India?
Okay, let me. One can talk about many such companies which have done exceptionally well in India. They followed the right strategy. They took it as a long haul kind of a thing and not short term, with short term view, and believed in the potential which India can offer to them. So I can talk about, if you're talking about automobile, then Suzuki, which the Japanese company came into the Indian market in 1984-85 and has been there and is the leading automobile player in India. Has been there for almost now 30 years. And Suzuki India's operations contribute significantly to the overall global Suzuki numbers in terms of the revenue as well as the bottom line or the profits. Then when you talk about consumer durables, you can talk about both Samsung and LG, which have done very well in India. In fact, they have created a strong brand name for themselves in India, and they are very well entrenched in the consumer durable products. When it comes to IT, I think both IBM, HP have established a very strong name, and now they become part of the Indian life. Then when you look at telephone or telecom, you have people like Vodafone, which have done extensive kind of a penetration into the Indian market. When you look at large industrial houses like GE, for example, over the last 20-25 years, they have established a strong name almost in all sectors of their operations, including their GE Finance or GE Capital. Then they have got a strong BPO operation. Then they are very strong in the industrial technology and production. So you can talk about Japanese names, you can talk about the Korean names, you can talk about the American names. As far as the banking and financial services are concerned, you'll find most of the well-known European or American banks have got themselves well entrenched into the Indian market. So whether it is Citibank, whether it is JP Morgan, whether it's HSBC, Standard Chartered Bank, they're very well, Deutsche Bank, they're very well entrenched in the Indian market and have got a deep penetration in most of the Indian urban, semi-urban markets. Of course, they're not still there in the rural markets. But so I think those who have taken a long-term kind of a view of the Indian economy have done exceedingly well. And there is a saying that many companies believe that if you kind of come with a long-term view and get yourself well entrenched, Indian markets will give you a very high return on equity, much higher than what you can get in many other markets. And our company has done a lot of research work in this area, and I can tell you based on that research that many companies, the international companies which have been now operating in India and have been there for last 15 to 20 years, they generate much more higher return on equity or return on investment in India as compared to even their home market. So India will be a good market for many of these companies.
And I'm curious, since you have led many different businesses at the Tata Group, how does the Tata Group look at this? You know, you have these global corporations coming into the Indian market. Do you feel like you should then go and compete with them a little bit in their home markets too? And how does the transaction you mentioned at Tata Motors fit into that view where you bought very well established brands and added them to your business?
I think Mr. Tata, who is our group chairman, he around 15 years ago or 10 years ago made the group look outward, and he had a very clear vision or thought process in terms of why he did it. To start with, his point of view was that India is of course a great market, but it always, any market for that matter, it's not just Indian market, but any market goes through the cycles of growth and the degrowth, so recession and so on and so forth. So you can't, when you want to become a successful business group, you can't depend only on one market. So you need to go outside of India and de-risk your business model. So that was the first principle. Then of course, when he looked at, and all of us looked at various markets, we also looked at the principles of, are we getting, and when we looked at acquisitions of companies like Jaguar Land Rover or Chorus, or for that matter so many acquisitions which the group did in the last 10 years or 12 years. The other principles were, of course, as I said, the de-risk your business model by getting into different economies. The second one is expand your marketplace. The third one is, can you get new technology by acquisition, or can you get a new product which you otherwise don't have, or even if you decide to do on your own, develop new product on your own, it will take a long time or it will require huge amount of investment. On the other hand, if you have got the ability to buy something at more attractive prices, why not do it? So getting new technology, getting new product, getting access to the new markets, expanding the universe of your business so that you can spread your costs, by taking the advantage of economies of scale. It also helped us in terms of creating the talent pool, because you can then bring the talent from outside into the country, or sending the Indian talent outside, and then have a very high employee engagement and retention. So it all has worked very well. Now, taking specific example of Jaguar Land Rover, we started our entry into the passenger car segment in 1995 when we launched Indica. But that was the small car segment. Then of course we also went into the Nano, which is still a smaller car. But then we, based on the Indica platform, we went into the mid-sized cars, or the sports utility vehicles. And that's the kind of a purpose or objective which got served when we acquired Jaguar Land Rover. So we could be now considered to be a full-fledged automobile company, not only an Indian player but a global player, which has got technology across all the platforms, from small car to the luxury car segments, or small utility vehicles to the big utility vehicles. So that's something which we could get. And of course, now when you grow in size, then you become a large player, and with economies of scale, so your ability to negotiate better price or better terms and conditions with your component suppliers or raw material suppliers improves significantly.
That's interesting. And is Tata Motors is publicly listed,
Yes.
obviously. Also as an ADR, I believe.
Yes, it's also listed on the New York Stock Exchange. Yes.
Are any other Tata companies listed?
Most of the companies are listed either in London or
Okay.
Luxembourg or Singapore through their depository receipt programs.
And they
Either
are
GDR or of course ADR
Right,
is only
right.
Tata Motors and Tata Communications.
Right. And those companies that are part of the Tata Group but are listed, they're run independently but also as part of the group. Is that right? How does that work?
Yeah, I think let me clarify this whole structure. All the listed companies have independent board, and we follow very strong corporate governance mechanism where we have in most of these companies we have 50-50, that is the 50% independent board members and 50% maybe from the Tata Group. We have very strong audit committee mechanism. We have got very strong grievance committee or strategy review committees, the nomination committees of the board, the remuneration committee of the board, committees of the board. So we have a very strong mechanism in terms of the corporate governance. We also have whistleblower policy. So, and it's kind of the chairman of the audit committee. So any whistleblower which is sent goes directly to the chairman of the audit committee of the company, and the chairman is an independent director, and we give the protection to the whistleblower, and we kind of ensure that he is fully protected. So we have overall a very strong corporate governance mechanism. Of course, these companies are part of the Tata Group, and Tata Sons and the group holding in most of these companies is between 26% to 35% or 40%, except in the case of TCS, the Tata Consultancy Services. Tata Sons holding is around 74%, but other than that, the holding is between 26% to 40%. So how do we bring the Tata culture or Tata value in system into these group companies? The strategy part, as I mentioned, is left to the individual board, and therefore individual companies management. But with regard to the ethical standards, the value systems, high standard of quality and performance, and we have a certain framework within which we operate, and that's something which is uniformly followed across the group companies. And this is something which Mr. Ratan Tata, who is the current chairman, brought it in 1991 onwards when he became the group chairman. So we have a very structured program to bring the high quality standards, the high performance standards, the ethical and value systems. So we have got Tata Code of Conduct. We have the Tata Business Excellence Model. We have the Tata Quality Service kind of a system. And we also participate in a big way in the corporate sustainability and corporate social responsibility initiatives. So these are all which are driven from the group level. Whereas I said the individual company strategy and execution is all determined by the board, and where we have got 50% independent board members, and we follow very strong corporate governance systems.
How many people are employed by the Tata Group companies?
Almost close to now 400,000 employees.
Wow.
Worldwide.
That's a lot. And most of them are in motors or?
No, the biggest employer is Tata Consultancy Services, which is in the IT services area, and because of the outsourcing business model, then
does it compete with some of the well-known ones like Cognizant and
yes, IBM and EDS, and yes.
Okay. Very interesting. Do you anticipate that the Tata Group will look more at potential acquisitions of Western brands or companies in the future?
In the immediate, okay, then let me put it this way. It's not like, yes, in the immediate future, one may see acquisitions which are kind of in the current situation where the Western world and more particularly Europe is reeling under the kind of a pressure of recession and the economic perhaps collapse in some countries, the opportunity to buy or acquire some of the businesses or companies will be quite attractive. So I think a call will have to be taken by individual company in terms of if there is any opportunity. Again, going back to the point which I made, whether it fits into your need for technology, need for new product, need for new markets. If it fits into that, and if the valuations are very attractive, then why not?
That sounds good. And could you just tell our viewers, just for education's sake, I know Tata Group is one of, if not the biggest. What are some of the other major industry or conglomerates in India that everybody should know about?
Now in India there is a group, I'm talking about purely Indian groups. There is a Reliance group, which is almost as big as the Tata group. It's now divided between the two brothers. Then you have got Birla, which is also a large industrial house. Then you have got Bajaj, Mahindra and Mahindra, Larsen and Toubro. These are some of the big names in the, then Godrej, then of course Jindal's, then Riya's, which runs SR Group. So these are some of these large industrial houses which have been there now, doing quite well.
And they're all listed in India?
Yes, some of them are even listed outside of India.
Interesting. Well, thank you very much for your time. I learned a lot, and I think
My pleasure.
everybody watching has as well. And it's very exciting what you're up to. I wish you all the best.
Thank you.
We'll keep watching India's progress.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.